It was the kind of autumn morning that wrapped itself around you. Not too cold, not quite warm, just enough breeze to carry the scent of turning leaves and distant bonfires. In a quiet Kansas town where everybody still waved from porches and the coffee shop knew your name, people were beginning to gather. It was Veterans Day, and in this part of the country that still meant something. American flags lined the sidewalks like whispers of pride. School children held paper signs. Folks wore caps with patches that told stories without saying a word. But on the far side of the crowd, away from the microphone and the folding chairs with names taped on the back, one old man sat alone. Not on the bleachers, not up front where the honored guests were. He chose a bench near the edge of the park, beneath a leaning oak that had dropped most of its leaves already. His name was Raymond Cole, and no one seemed to know it. Or if they did, they didn't remember it in the way that mattered. He wore a pressed though faded military uniform, the same one he'd worn decades ago, though time had shrunk him a bit since. His chest had no medals, no ribbons, just a name tag. Cole. That was it. On his lap was a small wooden box, the kind used to carry personal items, not awards, and a carefully folded American flag. The type given to widows or parents or brothers, the kind that never gets unfolded once it's tucked that way. Raymond wasn't there for recognition. He never had been. Truth be told, he didn't even plan to stay long. Each year he came for the same reason, to sit in silence, to remember a promise, and to leave before people started taking pictures for social media. That was how he preferred it. But this year was different. From the event tent, a volunteer coordinator, with a clipboard and headset, whispered something to a junior staffer, nodding toward Raymond. The staffer hesitated, then approached the bench like a waiter delivering bad news to the wrong table. "Sir," he began, with an awkward smile, "we really appreciate your service, but today's ceremony is for veterans who registered in advance. Also, there's a note that requests no uniforms this year, just to avoid any confusion or discomfort." Raymond didn't argue. He never did. He simply stood up, knees stiff, one hand gripping the armrest for balance. He gave a slight nod, not in agreement but in resignation, like he'd done this before, like he knew how it felt to be asked to step aside. Again, the young staffer blinked, almost surprised by the compliance. He turned and walked off without a thank you. Raymond took his flag, his box, and his silence and made his way down the paved walkway toward the park's edge. He moved slow, the kind of slow that doesn't ask for help, but makes you want to offer it anyway. As he walked, a few people noticed. An elderly woman in a red scarf who seemed to recognize something about him. A child who pointed and said, "Mum, he looks like Grandpa." But no one said a word to stop him. He found another bench. This one facing the pond, a little cracked, shaded by trees, and sat back down. His face was unreadable, not sad, not angry, just still. The town's loudspeaker buzzed to life in the background. A local pastor began his opening prayer. Names were read off, as always, followed by applause and the familiar chords of "God Bless America." But Raymond didn't clap. He didn't even turn around. He just held the wooden box on his lap, both hands resting on it like a man guarding something no one else could see. Somewhere in the crowd, a teenager named Eli Porter watched it all happen. He was volunteering that morning, part of the high school's civic engagement program. He was supposed to be handing out bottled water and helping elderly guests find their chairs, but his eyes kept drifting to the man under the oak tree. There was something in the way he sat, like he was still on duty, like he hadn't truly come home. Eli noticed the tattoo on Raymond's left wrist when he reached for something in the box. It wasn't flashy, no bald eagle or colorful flag. Just 3 stars interwoven with the faint silhouette of a falcon, faded, blurred by time but still intact, still visible. Something about it tugged at Eli's memory. His grandfather used to tell stories, not bedtime tales, but hushed memories from the war. Tales of a secret unit known only by code names. One of them was Ghost Talons, a group of men who went where no one else would. Missions that never made the newspapers. Heroes whose files were still sealed. Eli felt a chill despite the sun. That same tattoo. It was part of those stories, could it be? Could that quiet, shunned man with no place at the ceremony actually be one of the legends his grandfather used to whisper about? He didn't know it yet, but that question would change the entire day. Because sometimes history doesn't stand at a podium. It sits quietly under a tree, waiting for someone, anyone, to remember. Eli couldn't stop looking. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something else, something heavier, like a thread tugging at his memory, unraveling stories he didn't realize he still carried. His grandfather, Thomas Porter, had passed away 3 years ago, but the things he'd shared, in between cups of black coffee and long silences, stayed with Eli. Especially the story of the man with the falcon tattoo. He'd always described him the same way. Didn't talk much, didn't need to. But when things went sideways, that man got you home. They called him Sergeant Cole, no first name, no rank officially recorded. Just Cole, the man who carried 3 wounded soldiers across a rice field under heavy fire because the medevac was delayed. The man who refused a promotion because it would have taken him away from his unit. The man who, when everything fell apart, stood where others had fallen and made sure no one was left behind. Eli's chest tightened as he stared at the old man sitting under that tree. Could it really be him? Back at the main tent, the ceremony went on. Speeches, handshakes, small-town officials smiling for cameras. The mayor, a polished woman with perfect posture and carefully rehearsed patriotism, stood on stage reading from a list of names, most of which she'd practiced for the first time that morning. Then came the awards, shiny plaques, framed certificates, photo ops with selected veterans in business casual. No uniforms allowed, no disruptions, and all the while, just out of frame, Raymond Cole remained seated. Still, forgotten, until 10:23 a.m. That's when the sound of military tires crunching on gravel cut through the background noise. Most people didn't turn around, not at first. Just another military truck, they assumed. Maybe someone running late to the parade lineup. But Eli noticed. He always noticed the things others missed. A black Jeep Wrangler pulled up near the park's west entrance. Not standard issue, but unmistakably marked by the USMC decal on its bumper and the compact radio antenna on the roof. From the driver's seat stepped a man in full uniform, pressed dark green, sharp collar, boots shining despite the dust. He was young, maybe late 20s, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, the kind of presence that turned heads without trying. He paused at the edge of the grass, scanned the crowd, then turned his gaze slowly toward the outer edge of the park, to the bench beneath. The oak tree. When he saw Raymond Cole, he stopped dead in his tracks, Staff Sergeant Mason Hart. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. His boots moved forward, steady but silent, until he reached the path. Every step felt like gravity had grown heavier. The sun caught the edge of his uniform, glinting off the medals near his chest. A few people finally turned, not many, not yet. But something shifted in the air, as if everyone, even those still, clapping at the stage, felt something they couldn't name. Eli watched Mason Hart walk toward Raymond like a man crossing time itself. No cameras, no announcements, just 2 worlds about to collide. One old, quiet and nearly erased, and one young, proud and fully aware of who paved the road he marched on. When Mason reached the bench, he didn't sit. He stood tall, eyes locked on the older man's wrist, then slowly brought his hand up in a perfect, deliberate salute. It wasn't casual. It wasn't for show. It was the kind of salute soldiers give when they're in the presence of someone whose name carries more than rank. "Sir," Mason said clearly, his voice cutting through the morning like a sharp wind. "Are you Sergeant First Class Raymond Cole of Ghost Talon's Unit 17? The park went silent. No microphone needed, no speaker system required. Just that one sentence, and it rang louder than any speech given that morning. Raymond looked up slowly. His eyes were cloudy with age, but they sharpened in that moment, focusing on the young Marine standing before him. The silence stretched. His hand, resting on the flag box, tightened ever so slightly. He didn't nod. Not yet. He looked at Mason the way a man measures time, as if checking to see if the world had finally caught up. Then, at last, he spoke. Just one word. "I am." Mason's salute didn't drop. He cleared his throat, voice trembling just slightly now. "My grandfather, Corporal Ernest Hart. He said you saved him on Hill 58. Said if it wasn't for you, he wouldn't have made it home." Raymond blinked. That name, Hart, it clicked somewhere deep in his mind, like a lock turning after too many years untouched. "Ernie," he whispered, with the busted radio and the stubborn limp. Mason's lip twitched into the smallest smile. "That's the one." Raymond gave the faintest chuckle, almost a breath. "He never followed orders, still got the job done. He said the same about you." Then slowly, Mason lowered his hand and reached into his pocket. What he pulled out wasn't regulation, it wasn't official, but it meant more than most medals. It was a folded note, old, yellowed, creased from being read too many times. A letter Ernest Hart had written to his grandson before passing. In it was a name, Raymond Cole, followed by a line that said, "If you ever meet him, stand up straight. He's the reason you exist." Mason held it out. Raymond took it. His hands trembled as he opened the paper and read the familiar handwriting. For a second, he wasn't 84 anymore. He was 24, back in that field, back with the men who never made it out. The fog of time cleared, and something in his chest, long buried, stirred again. Tears didn't fall, and not yet, but the weight of memory pressed down on both men, and neither of them moved, until Eli, still clutching the water bottles he was supposed to be handing out, finally stepped forward. He didn't speak either. He didn't need to. He just snapped a single photo, one that would change everything in less than 24 hours, because in a world full of noise, it's moments like these, quiet, unplanned, unbearably human, that speak the loudest. By the time the mayor finished her speech, the crowd had already begun to shift. Not physically, most people still stood around the podium, polite smiles frozen in place, but something in the atmosphere had changed. You could feel it like static in the air. No one quite understood why until later that night. Eli had posted the photo around 3:12 p.m. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Just a snapshot, the kind his grandfather would have tucked into a worn wallet. It showed two men, one young and tall, one old and small, both soldiers in a way most people wouldn't see at first glance. No special lighting, no hashtags. Just a caption. Some heroes don't need a microphone, they just need to be seen. It took 11 minutes to hit 500 shares, then 5,000 tons. By dinner time, the photo was everywhere. Facebook pages with flags in their profile pictures reposted it with words like respect and finally. Veterans groups shared it in silent awe. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets, then, by some unseen digital wildfire, national headlines. The man in the picture? No one recognized him at first. He wasn't on any speaker list. No website had listed him as a guest. Of honor. There were no medals pinned to his jacket, just the name Raymond Cole. But the tattoo, that faded cluster of stars and a falcon, spoke louder than any newspaper ever could. Veterans across the country began commenting. That's a ghost Talon mark. My dad used to talk about him, swore he was real. He pulled 3 guys out of a fire in 1953 and didn't wait for a medal. Suddenly, Raymond wasn't a quiet man on a bench anymore. He was a question people couldn't stop asking. How did we miss him? Back in the town of Stillwater, Kansas, everything moved slower, always had. But that night, even Stillwater started to stir. At the diner just off Main Street, where Raymond usually had coffee on Sundays, the waitress, Jeanette, printed the photo and taped it to the wall near the register. He comes in every week, she told a local journalist. Tips $3 exactly. Never causes trouble. I didn't even know he was a vet. By Monday morning, reporters had gathered outside the high school. They weren't there for grades or sports. They wanted to talk to Eli. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't trying to go viral. He wasn't chasing likes or retweets. He just saw something real. And in a world that often forgets to look up, he'd happened to look at the right time. But when the cameras turned toward him, Toet asked, "Who is Raymond Cole to you?" He didn't quote war stories or list battlefield facts. He simply said, "He's the kind of man who doesn't ask for anything and deserves everything." And that was the moment the town began to remember, not just Raymond, But what Raymond represented, because sometimes it's not just one man being ignored. Sometimes it's a generation, a whole chapter of sacrifice that got written in invisible ink, because the ones who lived it were too tired, too humble, or too hurt to tell the story themselves. Raymond didn't own a smartphone. He had no idea any of this was happening. Until the letters started coming. By Wednesday, his mailbox was full, not bills, not junk. Letters, handwritten, folded carefully. Some were short, a single line. I served in Nam. I remember the talons. Others were pages long, stories of fathers, uncles, cousins, who spoke in whispers about a man named Cole, a man who never bragged, just acted, and saved lives. One envelope was from a fourth-grade class in Nebraska. Inside were crayon drawings of an old man with a big heart and a little bird on his wrist. One said, "Dear Mr. Cole, my grandpa cried when he saw your picture. He said you were the reason he came home. I hope you like blue, that's your jacket color now." Raymond didn't know what to do with any of it, so he took the stack, quiet and careful, and walked into the diner like he did every Sunday. Jeanette blinked when she saw the bundle in his arms. "I think these are for you," he said. She nodded slowly. "And what do you want me to do with them?" Raymond looked at the photo on the wall, the one with him and Mason Hart. He didn't smile, but his shoulders softened. "Put them where people can see," he said. "That's enough." And just like that, the wall of the diner changed. It became something sacred, a place of memory, of gratitude, of quiet justice. Someone brought in a corkboard the next day. Someone else framed the photo. A retired schoolteacher offered to transcribe every letter. No one asked permission. They just did it. Because sometimes, in the aftermath of silence, kindness rushes in like a wave. A local florist left a vase of daisies by the bench where Raymond had sat. No card, just a folded napkin that read, "We see you now." And finally, after nearly 70 years, he was no longer invisible. They didn't expect him to say yes. City Hall had never sent a letter quite like the one they mailed that week. Hand-delivered, thick paper, a formal gold seal on the envelope like. It was straight from Washington. Inside, an invitation. "Mr. Raymond Cole, we humbly request your presence and a few words at our Veterans Day commemoration this Sunday at Stillwater Community Auditorium." It was signed by the mayor herself, and underneath her name someone had scrawled in pen, "The town would be honored, sir." Raymond sat at the kitchen table, the letter unfolded next to his coffee. The sunlight hit it just right, like even the morning wanted to know what he'd decide. He held it in his hand for a long time, not reading it again, just feeling the weight of the paper, the kind of thick stock envelope you send for weddings, retirements, or apologies. He didn't answer. Right away, not out of pride, out of uncertainty. He hadn't spoken publicly in decades, not since the memorial in Seoul back in '54, where he stood in a quiet row of shadows and watched them bury the men he couldn't bring back. That was the last time he wore his full uniform. That was the last time he'd allowed himself to speak the names out loud. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was the napkin at the diner that read, "We see you now." Maybe it was the fourth-grade drawings, or the folded photo Eli handed him the day before, one of those same kids, holding signs that said, "Thank you, Mr. Cole." That night he picked up the phone and called the number at the bottom of the invitation. He didn't say much, just this: "If it helps others feel remembered, I'll go." Sunday morning arrived dressed in solemn skies. The wind was light, but steady, enough to make the flags outside Stillwater Community Auditorium ripple gently, not proud and loud, but respectful, like a nod of acknowledgement. Inside, every seat was full. Veterans of every era sat shoulder to shoulder. Men from the Gulf, women from Afghanistan, grandfathers from Korea and Vietnam. Some wore caps, others full dress. A few just came as they were, denim and dignity. At the front sat a single podium, no banners, no fireworks, just a folded flag on a stand and a chair to the side. Eli was there too, tucked into the second row between his mother and his history teacher. His hands fidgeted with the edge of a program, the print slightly crooked but the names bold and clear. At the very top, guest of honor, Sergeant Raymond Cole, Retitu. No one really knew what to expect. When Raymond finally stepped through the backstage curtain, there was a brief hush, not from anticipation, but reverence. He wasn't in uniform, just a clean button-down shirt, dark slacks, shoes freshly polished, his hair combed neatly to the side. On his left wrist, just beneath the rolled cuff, the falcon tattoo was still there. Faded, yes, but alive. He walked with a cane, slow, but steady. No one rushed to help him, not out of neglect and out of respect. He didn't want a spotlight, just the mic. When he reached the podium, he didn't shuffle his papers, didn't clear his throat. He simply looked out at the sea of faces, the ones who had forgotten and the ones who had never known, and then spoke. "I'm not a hero." That was his first sentence. Soft, clear, certain. "I'm not a legend, I just did the job. And then I tried to live quiet after. But if what I did helped someone, if it helped just one man get home, then I'd do it again tomorrow." That was it. No long speech, no medals shown, no names read aloud, just one truth spoken plainly. He stepped back, hands resting on the cane, and stood still for a moment. And that's when it happened. Every single person in the room stood. Not slowly, not in waves, all at once, as if some invisible wind had moved through their spines and lifted them in unison. It wasn't the kind of applause you give for a politician. It wasn't the cheers of a crowd entertained. It was something deeper, a soundless honoring, a room full of people who'd finally heard the voice of someone they hadn't even known they'd forgotten. Raymond didn't smile. Not really. But the corners of his mouth lifted just barely, like a man who didn't need claps to know he'd been understood. Like someone who'd finally, after all those years, been seen. Eli's eyes stung. He didn't wipe them. He just looked, memorized the way the light hit the side of the old man's face, the way his silhouette lingered like a statue that never needed to be carved in stone. The mayor offered to escort him down the steps. He shook his head. "I've walked harder ground," he said, and he descended alone, but not unnoticed. Not anymore. The ceremony ended, but something didn't quite return to normal. It wasn't anything dramatic. No parade broke out. No headlines ran across Times Square. But in Stillwater, Kansas, population just under 9,000, something had shifted. It was subtle, like a draft beneath the door, like a smell of rain before it touches the ground, and it started with the kids. Monday morning, Raymond Cole's mailbox was full again, but this time it wasn't just letters, it was art, construction paper, folded notebook paper, pages torn from sketch pads and school journals. There were handprints outlined in red and blue crayon. Some showed a smiling man under a tree with a bird on his wrist. One simply said, "Thank you for being the kind of man my dad tells me to grow up like." Raymond brought them to the diner like he had the others, but this time he didn't just hand them off. He sat at his usual booth, back left corner, seat facing the window, and taped one to the wall himself. Then another, then another. He didn't say a word, just nodded when Jeanette asked if he wanted his coffee black as always. By the end of the week, the entire side wall of the diner had transformed. What had once been blank, faded wallpaper was now a living mural of thank you notes and second-hand gratitude. People began calling it the memory wall, and that was just the beginning. One morning, Eli showed up with a box of tools. Raymond raised an eyebrow. "You starting a business?" Eli shrugged. "Starting with yours." Raymond's auto shop, Cole's service garage, had been running for nearly 35 years, quietly, efficiently. He never advertised, never raised his prices. Most weeks he barely broke even. But after the ceremony, people started showing up not just for oil changes, but just to shake his hand. And then came the real surprise, a group of high school students, the ones who normally wouldn't get out of bed for anything but a football game, arrived with paint buckets and ladders. "Permission to paint your sign, sir?" One of them said, grinning. Raymond narrowed his eyes. "You all know how to spell Cole's Garage?" They laughed, nodded, and got to work. By the weekend, the rusty old shop front had a fresh coat of navy blue, trimmed in white. Someone repaired the squeaky gate. Another donated a new sign. Someone else, a retired vet from 2 towns over, dropped off a full set of new wrenches and torque tools. "Thought you could use these," he said, from one ghost to another. Raymond didn't ask for any of it. He didn't need to. He just stood there wiping his hands on a rag, watching strangers become friends in the simplest way possible, by showing up. At the diner, Jeanette began reserving his booth every Sunday morning with a small brass plaque that read, "Reserved. For Mr. Cole, silent service always welcome." Even the church elders, who rarely changed the bulletin board, added a new weekly line. "Community Spotlight, Mr. Raymond Cole. Thank you for your continued presence and quiet courage." He didn't preach. He didn't lead prayer. But he showed up every Sunday. Same time, same quiet nod. Kids started waving to him on the street. A little girl named Hannah left a drawing on his windshield, a falcon flying over a mountain. In the corner, she'd written, "You helped him. Climb this." He kept that one folded in his coat pocket. Then came a knock on his door. It was Sarah Harrington, granddaughter of James Harrington, a man Raymond hadn't spoken of in 60 years. They had served together in Ghost Talons. James was a quiet strategist, always sketching out escape routes on napkins and maps. He was one of the few Raymond had trusted with his back and his silence. Sarah stepped onto Raymond's porch, carrying a small wooden box and a folded American flag. Raymond opened the door slowly, blinking in confusion until he saw her eyes. "You probably don't remember me," she began. But Raymond tilted his head and said, "You've got your grandfather's eyes." She nodded, swallowing hard. "We came to honor your birthday, and to say thank you, not just for him, but for all of us." Behind her, 7 Marines stood at attention, dressed in crisp uniforms, boots polished so clean they caught the afternoon light. One by one they approached, saluted, and placed a single hand over their hearts. Then, silently, they handed Raymond the box. Inside was a custom-forged medallion from the Navy SEAL Historical Foundation, engraved with his name, his designation, and the words "for service above silence." Raymond didn't speak. His thumbs brushed over the engraving like it might fade if he blinked. "I thought they'd forgotten," he whispered. Sarah smiled through tears. "We never did." He stood there for a moment, surrounded by a generation he never asked to lead, holding the weight of a history he never intended to carry, and for the first time in his long, weathered life, he wasn't carrying it alone. Not long after Raymond Cole's unexpected birthday tribute, the town council met in a closed session at City Hall. Normally these meetings dragged on over street repairs, recycling budgets, and what color the 4th of July banners should be. But this one felt different. The mayor, who'd once handed out plaques like candy on parade day, stood and cleared her throat. "I'd like to introduce a motion to rename 5th Street. The room blinked. 5th Street? It wasn't a glamorous Odekas. It ran behind the post office, past a broken-down laundromat and Raymond's auto shop. A narrow 2-lane street no one paid much attention to unless they lived there. We'd like to rename it Cole Way, or rather, Silent Service Way." There was a pause, and then someone seconded the motion, not for politics, not for headlines, just because it felt right. 3 weeks later, on a crisp Wednesday morning, a small crowd gathered at the corner of Main and what used to be 5th. No marching bands, no streamers. Just a clean metal sign, freshly planted into the earth. Silent Service Way in honor of Sergeant Raymond Cole, Ghost Talons Unit 17. Honor the quiet ones. Raymond stood beside it, wearing the same clean shirt from the ceremony, the sleeves rolled back just enough to reveal the tattoo. He touched the pole gently, like it might disappear if he pressed too hard. There were no cameras, no speeches, just a few old friends. A couple of high school kids, Eli, Sarah, Jeanette, and a dog from the neighborhood that kept circling everyone's feet like it knew something holy had happened. Eli handed Raymond a folded piece of paper, the town proclamation. He didn't read it aloud, just folded it again, tucked it into his coat, and nodded. "Let's go fix a carburetor," he said to Eli, and just like that they walked back toward the shop. Life, as it tends to do, settled again, but it never really went back. Tell her how it was, because now every time someone drove down Silent Service Way they slowed down, not because of traffic, because of reverence. At the auto shop, things were busier than ever. Raymond, though slower on his feet, still ran the place like a master conductor. He taught Eli how to rebuild an alternator, showed a retired mechanic how to keep the new lift from squeaking, answered the door with a grease-streaked rag in one hand and a memory in the other. He didn't talk about the war, not unless someone asked the right way, and even then, he didn't glorify it. He talked about teamwork, about nights without sleep, and days without guarantees, about men who sang out of tune to stay sane, about carrying more weight than just gear. Once, when a local reporter asked what ghost talons really meant, Raymond simply replied, "We were the ones who walked," and quietly so others could walk out loud. And that was that. One summer afternoon, a boy no older than 7 wandered into the shop, wide-eyed and holding a crumpled drawing. It was a falcon, colored in blue, perched on a tree branch above a muddy field. At the bottom, in shaky letters, it said, "Mr. Cole, I want to be brave like you." Raymond looked at the picture, then at the boy. "Being brave," he said, crouching to meet his eyes, "ain't about not being scared. It's about standing anyway." The boy nodded seriously, like he understood the entire weight of that sentence. Raymond pinned the drawing next to the cash register. Not long after, someone from the high school asked if they could name the annual Civic Award after him. Raymond declined politely. "Don't name it after me," he said. "Name it after the ones who never came home." But they compromised. Now, every May, Stillwater High gives out the Cole Honor Award to the student who shows up without being asked, leads without needing credit, and helps without expecting thanks. The first recipient, Eli Porter. Years passed, but the bench under the oak tree, the one where Raymond first sat that Veterans Day, never stayed empty long. People stopped by often, sometimes with a thermos of coffee, sometimes with a folded note, sometimes with nothing but time. They didn't come for stories. They came for something rarer. Presence. Raymond didn't always talk, but he always listened, and that's what people remembered most. Not his war record, not the medals he never wore, but the way he made you feel heard. Like your little moment in his big life still mattered. That, in its quiet way, was the truest kind of service. Raymond Cole never wanted a spotlight. He didn't need his name etched into granite or his story printed in school textbooks. He never asked for recognition, never gave interviews, and certainly never told people what he'd done. He just kept showing up, to work, to the diner, to the bench under the old oak tree, always early, always steady. But life, like all good stories, has a final chapter. And Raymond's came in the most fitting way possible, quiet, graceful, and wrapped in the same kind of stillness that had defined his entire life. It was a crisp September morning, one of those days where summer hasn't quite let go, but autumn is already brushing the leaves with gold. The air smelled like dry hay and wood smoke. School buses hummed down Silent Service Way. Jeanette had just unlocked the diner when she noticed something strange. Raymond hadn't come in. She waited, poured his usual coffee, black, no sugar, and kept it warm near the window. But the booth stayed empty. Eli noticed it too. He drove by the shop and saw the gate was still shut, the tools untouched, the door locked. That hadn't happened in years, not even during snowstorms or flu seasons. Something wasn't right. By noon, word had traveled faster than rumors usually did in Stillwater. A neighbor had found him that morning, peaceful, in bed, asleep, with his boots neatly by the door and his flag box still resting on the shelf near his kitchen table. Raymond Cole had passed away during the night. No pain. No drama. Just a soft, final breath in the town he had once believed had forgotten him, but that now loved him like a father, a brother, a sentinel. The mayor lowered the flags to half-staff before sunset. The high school cancelled classes that afternoon. Eli and a group of classmates began placing candles and flowers at the auto shop. Others came with notes, folded drawings, coffee cups with his name on the sleeve. By sundown, the front step of Cole's garage looked like a memorial shrine, not fancy, not flashy, but full of love. Some left boots, some left letters. One left a wrench tied with a ribbon. The funeral took place at Stillwater's first church, the white one with the peeling paint and the slightly crooked steeple. The pews were full long before the service began. They came in all forms: work boots and military dress, baseball caps and choir robes, denim jackets with faded patches. Some were old soldiers, some were young dreamers, most were just townspeople, the ones Raymond had fixed a tire for, waved at from his porch, or simply nodded to across the diner. The service was simple, just how he would have wanted it. No slideshow, no reading of awards or battles or dates, just one song, Taps, played slow and low on a single trumpet, like it had to tiptoe through the silence he left behind. At the cemetery on the outskirts of town, 6 Marines, including Staff Sergeant Mason Hart, carried the wooden casket. Not because they were assigned, not because they had to, but because when a man like Raymond Cole goes home, you show up. Sarah Harrington sat in the front row. She held a photo, the same one Eli had taken years ago. The image of Raymond and Mason, the coffee cup, the folded flag, the story no one could unsee once they'd seen it. After the final salute, Sarah stepped forward. She laid that photo gently on the polished wood of the casket. Then she whispered, "You kept the promise for both of you." And she wept. Not loudly, not for attention. Just the kind of soft, grateful cry that comes from knowing you've met someone rare, and that their absence will echo longer than most voices ever do. When the town voted to engrave Raymond's headstone, they asked Eli to write the inscription. He didn't hesitate. He didn't quote a Bible verse. He didn't list military honors. He didn't even mention ghost talons. He simply wrote, "His silence spoke volumes. His service changed lives." And below that, carved into stone, was the tattoo. 3. Stars. A falcon, and space around it, like the stone itself knew it needed to breathe. The Sunday after the funeral, Jeanette left Raymond's booth untouched. No one sat there, not even the regulars who usually fought for a window seat. She poured 1 cup of black coffee and set it on the table, just like always. No sugar, no cream. The steam curled gently in the morning light, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed, like he'd be walking through the door any second with a nod and a soft morning. But the town knew. He was gone. Still, his presence never left. Someone had bolted a small brass plaque onto the table, reserved in memory of Sergeant Raymond Cole, Ghost Talons, G-17. Some men carry the mission long after the war ends. People began leaving things behind, not just flowers or notes, but pieces of themselves. A mechanic's glove, a Bible, a ribbon from a county fair. One woman tucked a yellowed telegram from 1953 into the sugar caddy. It simply read, "He made it out." Raymond never asked for a legacy, but that's what made his legacy impossible to ignore. Down at the high school, Eli, now a senior, stood at the head of a class full of wide-eyed freshmen. He wasn't a teacher, not officially, but the principal had asked if he'd speak to the Civic History Club. He brought with him only one item, a copy of the photograph. He held it up, and in his voice, no longer just a kid's, but not yet a man's, he told the story. Not the war, not the secrets, but the moment. This picture was taken seconds after I realized I was standing next to the kind of man history forgets, unless someone makes sure it doesn't. One student raised her hand. Why didn't he ever ask to be remembered? Eli smiled softly, because he thought doing the right thing was enough, and for him, it was. Mason Hart returned to the shop once, months after the funeral. He didn't come to speak. He just parked his Jeep out front, walked to the bench beneath the oak and sat. In his lap, he held a folded piece of paper. He stared at the tattoo engraved on the bench's side rail and whispered, "You never needed rank. You were always the one we followed." Then he stood, saluted the wind, and drove away. Back on Silent Service Way, the shop still stood. The new owners, 2 young mechanics Raymond had trained himself, kept the name Cole's Garage. Every invoice came with a small quote printed at the bottom. "Finish the job. Leave." No one behind. Our colon beneath the quote, a watermark of a falcon in flight, customers noticed. Veterans smiled. Kids asked questions. A boy named Henry, 10 years old, hair always messy, came in one day with his dad. While they waited for a tire rotation, Henry stared at a frame on the wall, the medallion from the Navy SEAL Historical Foundation. He turned to one of the mechanics. Was he famous? The mechanic paused, then said, "Not really, just important." Henry nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that would echo in the years to come. How do I be like that? The answer wouldn't come from textbooks. It would come in small choices, like holding a door open for someone with tired eyes, or listening when someone speaks softly, or recognizing the person in the corner seat, not just for what they've done, but for what they carry. Still water changed, not in ways the world would write headlines about, but in its rhythm. In the way people looked at each other a little longer, the way they spoke a little softer, the way they let silence have its rightful place, not as an absence but as a kind of truth, because Raymond had taught them that silence could be powerful. It could say, "I'm here. You're not alone. You mattered. You still do." And as the years went by, the name Raymond Cole became more than a name. It became a lesson in humility, in presence, in service without applause, and most of all, in the kind of strength that doesn't come from medals or speeches, but from simply showing up again and again until the people who once forgot finally remember. 34 years later, Eli Porter stood before a podium much like the one Raymond Cole had once faced, modest, wooden, aged by time. His hair had grayed at the temples, the sleeves of his blazer were rolled just enough to show a small embroidered patch on his wrist, a falcon barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. Behind him was a crowd of high school students, teachers, veterans, and townspeople. The old diner was still there. So was the garage. But the oak tree, the one where Raymond had once sat in silence, had long since fallen in a summer storm. In its place stood a smooth stone bench with a bronze plaque bearing Raymond's name and one short line: "Finish the job. Leave no one behind." Eli hadn't meant to be the one to carry the story, but stories have a way of choosing who tells them, not based on fame or title or strength, but on attention, on heart, on the ability to see someone when others look away. He cleared his throat and looked at the crowd. "You probably didn't know him," he began. "He wasn't famous, he wasn't loud, he didn't take up space or ask for attention, but he was the kind of man who changed the people around him just by showing up." A gentle breeze passed through the trees. Some of the younger kids fidgeted as kids do, but most were quiet, listening in that soft, leaning-in way that only real stories can create. Eli smiled. "I was 17 when I first saw him, not just with my eyes, but really saw him. An old man sitting alone, a tattoo on his wrist that told more truth than 1,000 speeches, and I took a photo, not for fame, not to prove a point, I just didn't want to forget." He paused, then held up a copy of that very photo, laminated now, edges worn from decades of handling. Behind him, the image had been etched into a permanent plaque on the school's memory wall. We didn't know what we had, not until we nearly lost it, but we remembered, because of one moment, one act, one Marine who saluted, and a whole town that, for the first time, stood up and listened. A young boy raised his hand timidly. Was he scared? In the war, I mean? Eli nodded. "Yes, I think he was, but he went anyway. And that," he added, his voice steady now, "is what real bravery looks like. Not being unafraid, but choosing to stand firm while afraid. That's the legacy Raymond Cole left us. That's what we carry." The auditorium filled with quiet, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Then Eli closed his notes, stepped away from the podium, and walked out the side door, down silent serviceway, past the mural of thank you. Notes and the shop now run by Raymond's great-nephew, past kids playing near the bench that bore his name. He paused at the spot where the tree once stood and sat, not to speak, not to be seen, just to remember. Because that's what we do with stories like his. We sit with them, we let them change us, and when the time comes we stand up, not for applause, but because someone else once did, quietly, faithfully, so we could find our way home.